Hello, Chris. Thank you for joining us. You're going to spend the rest of the day talking about various pieces of transportation. Talk to Chris about transportation fees and some work he's done, and then we're going to hear Bill, HB3 that came out of the Judiciary Committee to talk about driver's license suspensions that has a little bit of a revenue loss in it. And then after lunch, we'll get a big picture view of the whole thing from the DMV. So with that, Chris, I think you have a presentation for us and then also a great big old spreadsheet.
Madam Chair, if it's for the record, Chris Rupp, Joint Fiscal, if it works for you, I can run through the slides on the shared screen and then pass out the hard copies of the spreadsheet after.
Love that.
All right.
We're not distracted from your words with many.
You can be distracted as much as you want. I will not.
No, we cannot. We'll focus.
I'm just trying to share my screen here, so. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. For the record, Chris Root from the Joint Fiscal Office. It's nice to see you all today. Happy Friday. As the chair mentioned, I've been asked to come in and to sort of give you all a high-level overview of Vermont's transportation funding outlook in the next few years and discuss some potential options for the legislature to consider for how to deal with that transportation funding outlook. And then we'll wrap up with sort of a high-level overview of some analysis we did on fees that had not been adjusted since 2016. So I was in here a few weeks ago giving a sort of Transportation 101. So this slide will look familiar to those of you who were here. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just wanted to remind you all that Vermont, like every other state, funds its transportation program through a mix of state, local, and federal funds. Federal funds actually are the largest source of our state's transportation program. The formula funds are not free money from Washington. They typically require a match to draw down. And the sort of standard rule of thumb for that match is 80-20. So for a project that is federally eligible, the feds would pay 80% of the cost, and then the state would be on the hook for coming up with a non-federal share of the other 20. There are exceptions to that. Work on the interstates 90-10. Some safety work can be funded at 100% federal, but by and large, the good rule of thumb is the 80-20 split. Not everything that VTrans does is federally eligible. So typically maintaining the network is the responsibility of the states. So you will see T-Fund dollars almost exclusively fund the maintenance program, for example. The aid that the state gives to towns through formula for town highway aid, that's also straight T-Fund dollars as well. Something that I think Vermont doesn't get enough credit for, and you really do deserve more credit, is that you fund most of the transportation program on a pay-as-you-go basis. So the state really is not very reliant on borrowing to meet our immediate transportation needs, which really saves tax dollars in the long run because you're not paying interest costs, and it maintains your financial flexibility in future years. So why are we here talking about this? We have sort of what I view as a good problem to have. With the infrastructure bill that was passed in 2021, there is a significant increase in federal dollars coming to Vermont. We are looking just based on sort of the core Federal Highway Administration formula funds that go out to the states, an increase of about $324 million over the 5-year life of the IIJA. Plus, that law created some new supplemental programs that we're going to benefit from. So there's $225 million exclusively for bridges and $21 million for electric vehicle infrastructure. Those are not typical sort of core programs that we see in every multi-year transportation bill, but those are new programs that are bringing a lot of money to Vermont through the IIJA. I think it remains to be seen whether these programs will continue beyond the life of the IIJA. But right now, that funding is available to us. And when you consider the increase in the core programs, plus these two new programs, you're looking at $570 million of new federal dollars being available to Vermont. That's a roughly 30% increase in the core funds and a 50% increase when you consider it all. So this is a great opportunity for Vermont to make major investments in our infrastructure, but it's going to create a significant challenge for us. As I mentioned, these federal funds are not free. They require a match. When you have more federal funds being available, you need to come up with more match to draw it down. And the revenue forecast really expects Vermont state transportation revenues to be almost flat in future years and inadequate to maximize the IIJA funds that are coming to us just based on the revenue forecast alone. So some of you have seen this chart in the past. This just gives you a sense of what that revenue forecast looks like and where the funding comes from to support our transportation program. You will see that fuel taxes on gas and diesel are pretty significant. The gas tax is projected to continue declining in future years. Purchase and use tax has been a growing share of the transportation revenues. DMV fees have been relatively flat, and those are adjusted by statute, and they have last been adjusted in 2016 to take effect for fiscal year 2017. And then miscellaneous revenue is, there's some fees and some, a whole lot of other smaller revenue sources. Your civil traffic fines go there, a lot of other miscellaneous income that the agency generates. The latest revenue forecast in January downgraded the T fund by $1 million and the TIB fund by 1.8. So in total, the forecast was downgraded by $2.8 million across both of those funds for 23. And when you look at both the T fund and the TIB fund revenues, all the way at the bottom of the chart, you're looking at a compound annual growth rate of about 1.13% on average. Do any of us expect costs are going to grow by 1.13% on average?
Not most years.
No.
This is just a graphic depiction. Sometimes pictures are nice, but you can see that the line there showing the T fund revenues in the future years is not growing very steeply. So this projected funding gap is not a new issue. This was actually flagged last year, and the agency raised this as a risk last year. And again, this year, the governor's recommend acknowledges that this is an issue and does contain a plan for addressing the revenue gap. So the administration expects that there's a roughly $79 million gap between what is going to come in through T fund revenues and what the match requirements are going to be to draw down the formula funds that we're expecting, as well as the competitive grants that we're expecting to get. So how would this $79 million gap be closed? The administration's proposal is to, for FY24, transfer $10.95 million from the general fund into the T fund, and also have $20.7 million of T fund reversions of unspent appropriations. So that 10.9 of general fund transfer plus the 20.7 million of reverted unexpended T fund appropriations is how the budget essentially balances for this year. For FY25 and FY26, the proposal is to reserve $68 million of surplus general fund dollars in the FY24 budget, basically set that money aside, and then draw money from that reserve to help bridge that gap in 25 and 26. So we're talking right now about just the $79 million projected gap to close the federal match issue, but we should also be mindful of the fact that in addition to that, base costs are expected to grow by roughly $7 million a year as well. So that's your payroll costs, your employee benefit costs, your shared services costs, the amount that goes out to the towns through formula aid, which has a CPI escalator. That's what I'm talking about with the base costs. There is, as I mentioned, the governor's recommend does contain a proposal for getting us through FY26. It rests heavily on general fund surpluses and transfers of those general fund surpluses to the T fund. but there's not a clear plan in place to close the gap in future years beyond FY26. So you as legislators have some options to think about. One option is to keep more T-fund revenue available for transportation. Something to keep in mind is that, do you have a question, Madam Chair? Okay. The vast majority of T-fund dollars are already used for transportation purposes and support the Agency of Transportation. There are a few exceptions, though. The most prominent exceptions of T-fund dollars supporting other activities are what we colloquially call the JTOC appropriation. But what that really is the annual appropriation to help support the state police. So in recent years, $20.25 million has been appropriated out of the T-fund over to the Department of Public Safety to support the state police. In addition, $4.2 million is appropriated to BGS to operate the information centers along the highways. That's, to maintain to pay the folks who are inside maintaining the operation and keeping them going. And there's a roughly $500,000 annual transfer from the T-fund to the downtown fund, which is managed by ACCD and makes grants to communities to make transportation related improvements to their downtowns. If decisions are made by the legislature to end these appropriations and fund these activities from some other fund, that will keep more dollars in the T-fund available for transportation, but you're effectively shifting these costs to other funds of government without inherently adding more dollars into the mix. So I think that's kind of a no-brainer. I mean, it's just a matter of which account you're paying the cost out of, but it's not a net increase of available resources.
Mm-hmm. Chris, those transfers, do any of them make drawing down other federal money possible, or are they just transfers out that are one time? They don't leverage any other money.
These are annual transfers that do not directly leverage other money. But if that funding was made available in the T fund instead, those dollars could be used to draw down federal money.
Thank you.
Question?
Yes, sir.
On the reversions, is that money left over from completed projects, or are they projects that have been abandoned, or why is there so much? What's the nature of the reversion?
A lot of it has to do with timing, and most of the reversions that are proposed, about 13 million of the 20.7 million in the governor's recommend, really have to do with two line items, and they're the grants to the town structures and class 2 programs. That reversion, it reflects an adjustment in the timing of making these payments to towns. So every year, VTrans will make grant awards out to the towns, but it takes several years to subsequently pay out the grant awards because it takes time for the projects to be underway. So rather than banking up all these unexpended balances of T-fund dollars in sort of carry forward appropriations, what the agency is proposing is reverting some of those unexpended balances, making them available for reappropriation, and essentially budgeting more on a cash basis moving forward. So something I want to be very, very clear about is that proposal does not involve reducing what the towns would get. It doesn't involve canceling a grant agreement or anything like that. What that proposal really reflects is budgeting based on the years that we expect the bills to come due. So if you're, for example, going to put $8 million of grants out this year, rather than just sit on that $8 million, if you know you're going to dribble it out in $2 million a year, the agency is proposing to budget that $2 million a year moving forward. Okay. You will always have carry forwards and reversions because a lot of it has to do with timing. Projects might get slipped from fiscal year to fiscal year or delayed, or, you thought something would cost $1,000 and it came out at $980. So big areas, it's unpredictable how your winter's going to go. So oftentimes you'll have carry forwards in your maintenance line.
Okay, but it will need to be spent later. Those projects are going to have.
Correct. It doesn't jeopardize any projects, the reversion now.
And the Transportation Committee is, the vast majority of what they do is going through the budget and making sure they understand it and the reversions and all of that. we are here today because there is a hole, and that hole is being described to us, basically.
Do you have a sense of what the appropriation to the state police funds, is that restricted or can they use it for any purpose?
The only restriction that I'm aware of is the statute says at least $2.1 million of the appropriation is dedicated to state police vehicle replacement. But otherwise, anything sort of above that goes towards supporting their overall budget. It doesn't fund the entire thing, but it contributes toward it.
Yeah.
T-bills money versus T-fund. T-bills, you said we're mostly PAYGO now, or exclusively PAYGO.
Well, I should say there's no differentiation.
T-bonds, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so everything we're doing right now is on a pay-go basis. There are no outstanding transportation infrastructure bonds. The last ones that were out were paid off in last year's BAA. So now all of the money that comes to the TIB fund is available for supporting the transportation program on a pay-go basis.
That was my question. So TIB money, even though it's usually would be bonds, is being used as PAYGO.
Correct. Yeah, the way the statute reads is once your debt service obligations are satisfied, the leftover money that comes into the TIB fund is then available to use on a pay-go basis. And there always is leftover money because the bonds were issued, I think, with a 3-to-1 debt coverage ratio in mind. So there was always going to be more revenue coming in than the expenses every year for the debt service.
So is there a difference between money that's in the T fund as opposed to money that's in the TIB fund?
There is one major difference. The TIB money is to be used for road, bridge, heavy construction projects that have a remaining useful life of at least 10 years. So there are an enormous number of projects in the transportation budget that can be used for, but you wouldn't use TIB funds for snow plowing costs, for example.
So bondable.
You would use it for physical infrastructure that has a long remaining useful life.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Representative Anthony, did you have something?
Yes, I did.
And then we're going to go on to the next slide.
Just to be clear, Chris, the assumption about the gap that the chair reminded us is our focus. That's assuming that the Transportation Committee here is committed to leaving no dollars on the table for the match at the moment. If that changes, because policies shift, the gap will change.
Correct.
Thanks.
All right, so there's another option you all have as legislators to consider. Keep more transportation revenue in the T fund. So the vast majority of transportation tax and fee revenue currently remains in the T fund to support transportation, but there are some exceptions. So in terms of the non-transportation uses of transportation revenue, the one this committee is probably most familiar with is the fact that a third of the purchase and use tax revenue goes to the education fund. That generates almost $50 million to the education fund every year. The legislature does have the option to put more of that money in the T fund and out of the ed fund, but I think you all know very clearly that if you do that, absent another revenue source, that cost is borne by property taxpayers by default. So that is an important consideration to keep in mind. Gasoline tax, vast majority of it remains in the T fund, but very small fractions of it get diverted to the DUI enforcement special fund and the Fish and Wildlife Fund and for Forest Parks and Recreation. 2.2 million roughly is diverted in combination. But 2.2 million may not sound like a lot in the big picture, but for these smaller funds, that's a lot of money. So in the absence of other revenue sources, reducing that allocation to the other funds would obviously create revenue shortfalls in those funds. Motorboat registration funds, another place where they go. I'm not going to talk a lot about motorboats today, but 12% of that money does go to the T fund, and a lot of it also goes to other sources. But you're talking about $140,000 annually to the T fund. This is an extremely small piece of the puzzle. Yes.
Representative Brannigan.
Thank you for all your presenting to us. So I've been out of office 4 years. When did this purchase and use tax change occur?
That's a great question. And I researched this a couple weeks ago. It happened about 20 years ago.
20 years?
Yeah, it did. And it happened in combination with several other factors. So the Ed Fund used to get a piece of the gas tax.
Yeah.
And as part of a broad shift of funding sources, and I want to say this was around 2003 or 2004, I can get the exact chronology. The gas tax went out of the Ed Fund and into the T Fund. And to sort of make things revenue neutral, the Ed Fund got a bigger share of the purchase and use tax.
I remember that. I remember the gas tax moving.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
It was a big
I believe you.
puzzle back then that
Yeah.
there was a whole lot of money going in and out of the Ed Fund and the T Fund. And that was when sort of the current system of funding the Ed Fund was put into place. But
Is that when the bond,
that came later. That came later.
how much later?
The TIB fund and the TIB bond construct was put in law, I believe, in 2009.
I remember setting up that bond.
Yeah.
It took a lot of guts. No one was certain. Wasn't it was it Jeb Spalding?
It may have been, and Representative Masland, I learned, is the resident historian on the TIB fund. But yeah, it was created as a way to borrow money without it being reflected against the bonded indebtedness of the state, because it's considered a special obligation revenue bond.
And at the time that not the bond, but the time of the purchase and use versus gas tax, I imagine it was a better deal for the transportation fund than it.
Well, at the time, everything was meant to be pretty much revenue neutral at that point in time. Over time, the shift has disadvantaged the T fund, and particularly in recent years. And it's quite frankly due to the fact that gasoline consumption pretty much peaked around 2005 and has been on a slow decline since then. And sort of the opposite has happened with the purchase and use tax. And the purchase and use really, especially in the last 2 years, has just been going like gangbusters. So.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Right. In the cafeteria, since we don't have senators in the House chambers, or committee rooms, we could have a discussion with Richard Westman, who's chair of House Transportation and knows at least far more about that idea than I do. But he's a good source of information that we can pull.
Senators are allowed in here. They just tend to not come in.
Well,
But you're welcome to be in the cafeteria.
we can talk with Richard Westman, any of us who want to in the cafeteria.
Sure, okay.
And he does financing for PSAC. I mean, he's a very good witness with regards to all kinds of things that concern this discussion.
So you all have a third slide full of options here, which is generate more transportation revenue and put more money into the mix rather than shifting costs or revenues from fund to fund. Some important considerations for you all are that gasoline tax revenue has declined over time and it's expected to keep declining in the future. The diesel tax is relatively stable over time compared to the gas tax, but it's a relatively minor revenue source. A cent on that only generates around $600,000 of revenue because it's just not as big of a tax base, whereas a cent on gasoline generates just shy of $3 million in additional revenue because that tax base is huge. Purchase and use revenue has been growing over time, but there's some big known unknowns right now, which is what are higher interest rates going to do to vehicle sales and the possibility of economic contractions in future years. You all can either adjust that tax rate or something that the legislature has done with fee bills is adjust the $2,075 maximum that's currently in statute that's charged to heavy vehicles. So in previous fee bills, that number has been indexed to inflation. So obviously, the higher that goes, the more money you can yield from larger, more expensive vehicle purchases. Important consideration is electric vehicles always comes up in this conversation. You're going to hear more from the agency about that later today. But the administration is proposing a mileage-based user fee and a registration for hybrid vehicles that would essentially replace foregone gas tax revenues. I would not consider those to be, massive new revenue sources. That's really to try to capture the revenue that these vehicles currently are not paying in gas taxes. And another option you all have as legislators is to adjust the existing transportation fees, which have not been adjusted since 2016 for the FY 2017 fiscal year. There's a high revenue generation potential with fees. They're easy to administer because the systems are already in place. And, think about what inflation's been like since the last time these fees have been adjusted. The purchasing power has been significantly eroded. So let's talk about inflation real quick. As you all know, it's been pretty high in recent years. You've heard from my colleague Joyce Manchester that there's a lot of ways to look at inflation based on the different indexes that the federal government puts out there. I wanted to show you 5 of them just to compare what some of them have looked like over time. So for purposes of illustration, I looked at what were the various indices at the beginning of FY 2017 and compare that to the latest available data. And you can see that based on how you count inflation and what you weigh and what goes into that mix, you have a low of the PCE showed a 19.8% increase, the CPI, 24.5% increase. You go all the way to the far right. The Federal Highway Administration puts out an index that tracks national highway construction costs. Now they track these costs nationally, not regionally. So there are some, imperfections in the data, but 51.8% in highway construction bid increases nationwide in recent years is pretty astounding. But I think that's illustrative of how much purchasing power is eroding in this economic environment. So if you apply these different inflationary growth rates to the most common fees that the average Vermonter pays, and just assume that we round things up to the nearest whole dollar for ease of administration, how would the cost change? You can see here that, the operator's licenses would go from 32 or 51 all the way up to, at the low end, $39, the higher end up to almost 50 for the 2-year license. Car registration, pleasure car registrations. I have a real issue with why we call them pleasure cars because I take very little pleasure driving my Subaru to and from work every day, but that is what the law says. That is what most of your constituents pay when they go to the DMV, when they think about their car registration. And everybody pays the inspection sticker every year, which is currently $6. So that just gives you a flavor of how the most common fees could be adjusted under the different inflationary scenarios.
And so generally when I am picking an inflation index, I pick the one that sort of most closely parallels the costs that we're inflating for. And so which one would you say most closely matches the costs of the transportation fund?
That's a really good question that I don't have a great answer for because I think there is an element of decision-making and policy that can be factored into the legislative process. I think in general, one of the best indices to track government expenditures would be the government consumption expenditure state and local deflator. It's a pretty high number though. The CPI tracks a different basket of goods and is really consumer focused. So if your focus is on, the economic comfort, for lack of a better word, of constituents, that's a good measure to look at. If you want to look at
We're focused on the costs that are borne by the transportation fund.
Yeah, the National Highway Construction Cost Index is imperfect because it's national and it doesn't always reflect regional differences. But I think that's a good metric to see how high these costs can really be. I don't know if there's a right or a wrong answer, though. I think there's quite frankly some squishiness to this. And if you look back at how the appropriations have grown to the agency since FY17, I think you're looking at a growth rate of T-fund growth rate of around 24, 25%. I sort of did that back of the envelope earlier today. So.
Yeah, some general comments that have come up in the last little while. Just looking at this chart though, I was wondering, different metric from what you were using, Madam Chair, which one of these are more aggressive or more progressive or regressive, and we all pay them. I mean, they don't discriminate. And so, in New Hampshire, I'm not favoring doing what they do in New Hampshire. They have essentially a property tax on motor vehicles every year. And some of them are very expensive, $400 or $500, depending on your, that's a lot of money, and I'm not advocating that we go that way. When we get back to the discussion, generally, more closer to where you started, Chris, if, for example, we were to institute the cloud tax, then we could, going back to your beginning, we could not have to transfer out of the T-fund things that could be supplemented with the cloud tax revenue.
I think we've paid for like 5 things hypothetically with the cloud tax.
But anyway,
There's only one cloud tax.
That's an alternative. Chris didn't suggest, we didn't ask him. Yes, no, that's, this committee's business. And just one question about the local projects that have been pushed out. It's true that they still get built, but if, like, for instance, Norwich and Thetford don't do a local project and put it off to another year, that may forego or curtail the ability of Thetford and Norwich to do a local project immediately following, because we take things in succession. So you're correct, they still get built, and it doesn't appear to affect T-fund dollars.
Right.
But if these things get postponed one after another, then in fact that there is I guess you could say a downgrade of local municipalities' ability to carry out these projects. So it's a picky point that I'm not going to argue, but I just thought I'd point that out.
Were you
Done? Thank you.
Okay. Chris, we have 20 minutes and you have a number of slides.
I do,
Okay.
but I'm almost done. So just for some context here, if all the transportation fees that had not been adjusted since 2016 were adjusted by 19.8%, that was the low inflationary measure on the other slide, you're looking at roughly $23.6 million of additional revenue funds that could be generated. Almost all of it for the T-fund. Then there's, a few other exceptions where this assumes that the purchase and use cap would be indexed as well. So obviously the ed fund would get a third of the sort of additional revenue from that. So that shakes out to be just under $600,000. And then for things like conservation plates and the Building Bright Futures plate, they get a small cut of that money too. So if those fees were adjusted, they'd get a little bit of money also. But that's a sort of a back of the envelope of applying a 19.8% growth rate to only the fees that hadn't been adjusted since 2016. You'll see on the chart that Saoirse is going to pass out in a few minutes that there are some fees that actually haven't been adjusted even longer than that. But I am assuming that the legislature probably had a policy determination when they chose not to increase some of those fees. It will make sense when you look at what some of those fees are. I didn't build those into my math, but if the legislature chose to increase them, we can build it into the math pretty easily. But they tend to be smaller unit fees, and they're things like renewing IDs for people who are on, Social Security disability and things like that. They're really low dollar fees. But $23.6 million if you applied that inflationary escalator.
Chris, going back to slide number 2, that shows the transfers from the general fund.
Slide number 2.
Yeah. There's a yellow band on the far right bar.
Oh, yeah.
It shows a transfer of 23.4 million.
Yeah, that was actually appropriations from the general fund. to the Agency of Transportation to support one-time investments in the
Okay,
20.
so it's not a coincidence that 23.6 number on slide number 12 and that 23.4 number on slide number 2 are so close.
Good.
That is a coincidence.
But it's a convenient one.
Yes.
It is a coincidence. Yeah, that number you referenced on the earlier slide reflects last year's big bill made a series of, not last year's, the FY23 big bill made a series of general fund appropriations to the Agency of Transportation. So they were things like electric vehicle incentives. There was money to have zero fare transit for a year. And there was a host of other items, but that's what that reflects.
Thank you.
So some considerations before we go to the spreadsheet that I just wanted to put in your minds and try to tie everything up is, states fund transportation primarily on a user pays model. What that really means is the costs of supporting the transportation system are paid by users of that system. And by users, we're really mostly talking about drivers and vehicle owners. There is an imperfect relationship to how much you pay versus how much you use, and no direct relationship to income. And, maybe the system's not perfect, but it's important to remember that the cost burden for supporting transportation is distributed pretty broadly and widely. So the average person spends relatively little in transportation costs every year. So that's just something to keep in mind that, things may not be based on an ability to pay, but it's also important to keep in mind of just how much people are paying. And it tends to be a somewhat smaller share of income than, say, thousands of dollars a year. So,
Chris, do you, in that context of motor fuel taxes are paid a proportion of fuel consumption, do you have any kind of data that indicates fuel consumption by socioeconomic levels? More people have to use more fuel.
I do not have data on that, but that is a really good question that is a very good segue into how messy that relationship can be. Because, 100 years ago when gas taxes were first implemented, there wasn't a whole lot of variation in fuel economy. And that has become a much bigger issue now, obviously, because, whether you drive a 30-year-old car or a large truck or something that is newer and more efficient and smaller is going to have a huge determining factor on how much you pay in gas taxes. Vermont has set up some programs in recent years to help income qualified individuals adopt more fuel efficient vehicles. But that is certain. Fuel economy is a huge variable in that equation. But something I wanted to really stress here is how much you pay depends on not only how much you drive, but on how fuel efficient your vehicle is. But the average Vermonter, you're looking at paying roughly $150 a year in gas taxes, and you're not paying it all at once. It's dribbled out every time you fill up at the pump. There are, of course, ways to reduce your tax exposure by adopting more fuel efficient modes of travel or altering your travel patterns. Obviously, that's not going to work for everybody in a highly rural state. But it is a variable that I wanted to raise. Motor fuel taxes, they imperfectly capture revenue from out-of-state motorists, but not everybody driving through Vermont and uses our roads pays fuel tax in Vermont. It's an imperfect reality of the system. We know electric vehicles currently are paying no or less tax toward the usage of the roads, which again, you'll hear from the agency to talk a little more about that later today. Fuel economy is really what has led to the decline in revenue since 2005. The increasing adoption of EVs has been a contributing factor, but it's really mostly driven by the fact that traditional internal combustion engines are just a heck of a lot more fuel efficient now than they were years ago. We're just burning less gas. But having said that, gas is still very much a very large tax base. And, increasing or making changes to those rates does still yield a lot of money. Fees are a little more complicated. Fees are a way of capturing revenue for I should have put quotes around this, but I pulled this out of the statute. They're a way of capturing revenue for a service or a function provided to or the regulation of specified classes of individuals or entities. So in this case, those specified classes of individuals are road users and individuals who process transactions with DMV. What you pay in fees is based on the type and the number of transactions, not on your income. But, when you think about it, there's some relationship to income when you think about if you're a higher earner, you're probably more likely to register and transact more vehicles. You're probably more likely to have multiple vehicles in your household. You might have some motorboats, snowmobiles, ATVs, things that you don't use in your daily commute, but are things that are nice to have. And, you pay fees associated with those. And remember that, the higher earners are likely to pay more in purchase and use tax if they buy more expensive vehicles. So there is a way of capturing an income sensitivity through some components of how we fund transportation. With the fees, again, it's important to remember how much people pay and how frequently they pay. The average person pays fees infrequently, annually when they renew their registration, or every few years when they get a new car or they renew their driver's license. Again, the fees that most people pay are not directly based on their road usage, but they're a means of capturing revenue broadly across most users to support the entire transportation network. It's important to remember that unlike some departments' fees, the transportation fees don't just cover the cost of DMV to have somebody working at the window and processing your transaction. The fees bring in far more than DMV costs to operate. DMV really operates as like a fiscal agent for the transportation fund in a way. And what you pay in fees is going not just to support them, but to support the entire transportation network. They're set by the legislature, as you all know. And as part of that process, you have the ability to have a little bit more flexibility and targeting than you might have with adjusting an excise tax on motor fuels. Some areas where the legislature has exerted that flexibility is, there are some small discounts for 2-year versus 4-year driver's licenses. There are reduced or waived fees for people with disabilities and veterans for certain transactions. And, the higher fees are charged for heavier vehicles like trucks. They pay based on how much they weigh. Sure do. So I put a few slides at the very, very end here just to remind you all that I'm not going to go through it now, but they're just references of where our gas and diesel taxes stack up relative to other states and how much all these different revenue sources bring into the mix. But this may be a good time for me to stop the screen share. Sorsha has some copies of sort of a preliminary analysis that I did based on the current DMV fees that are in place and applying that 19.8% escalator. So I want to be very, very clear that this is not a proposal from JFO. We don't make proposals. This is an illustration for discussion purposes for you all. So you have a sense of how numbers could move and what that means. What I would just draw your attention to is column 20 would be the additional expected revenue from the T fund, to the T fund from various changes. And column 10 and column 13 would show how the rounded up fee would be adjusted and the net additional increase increment is showed in slide 13 or on column 13. There's just a few things I wanted to point out as you skim down column 20. You're going to see that there's like a ridiculous number of fees on this list, but most of the money is generated from a few of them. The driver's licenses, the operator's licenses bring in a lot of money. And that's in line 9. So you'll see that, adjusting that brings in quite a bit. Some of the down to line 35 on that first page, adjusting the fees related to titles. While that's not a fee that a lot of us think about in our day-to-day life, increasing that fee brings in quite a bit of potential revenue because there's
What was that again?
line 35. Because there's so many transactions involved in it. On page 2, you'll see that vanity and special plates bring in, 200,000, could bring in 200,000, but really down to line 57 and 58, you're looking at your car registrations. Those are a very, very big revenue source. Truck fees are a little further down, starting in line 63. This number these are a rolled up total. If you really, really want to get into the weeds of where I got that number, the microscopic print on the back 8.5 by 11s show you those estimates. I want to spare you from having to go through that, and it printed way smaller than I hoped it would when I was playing around on my computer at 7:30 this morning. But I just wanted to give you a sense of the truck fees are really complicated, but they do have a pretty significant revenue generation potential. Trailer registrations, similarly, a little further down the list. Licenses and registrations, sort of a bottom line that they're pretty significant revenue sources.
Where are you?
Those were all on page, the registrations were on page 2, middle of page 2. You also see there's a lot of miscellaneous revenue sources, but a lot of them don't generate a ton of money. The certified copy of the 3-year operating record is the biggest one in terms of units. So that has quite a bit of revenue generation potential. The dealer and inspection stations, again, for a lot of these lines, you're not dealing with a lot of volume of unit transacted and not a lot of fees, but some of them have revenue, some significant revenue generation potential. The biggest one is on the top of page 4, the inspection stickers. So many inspection stickers are sold every year that adding $2 to that fee yields almost $1 million of additional revenue. You'll also see some of the excess weight,
I know.
line 129. And then you'll see the excess weight permits that are charged to trucks there as well.
What did you say? You put it up. Dollar raises how much?
So this would be, if you look at just the sheer amount of units transacted there, if you added $1 to that, you'd bring in almost $500,000 a year. So this model is predicated on adding $2 to it, and that yields $905,000 based on 453,000 stickers.
Represent
That,
if
yes.
Earlier, you mentioned a portion of the motorboat registration fees. Is that on this list or is it not?
That is not on this list. And if it was on this list and inflated at that level, I think it would bring in around $30,000 across all the fees. It's a really, really small revenue source.
Yeah, I was actually wondering the sort of other, do you know the rationale for motorboat fees coming to the T fund at all? I mean, is that?
I think it gets into some fairly complicated federal grant.
It's very complicated, and I think some other rationale is, the DMV is processing the registration transactions, and there is a cost associated with getting that boat to and from, or I should say there's some road usage associated with getting your boat to and from the water.
So you're registering the trailer that the boat goes on.
You register the boat too. You do them both, but yeah. The fees are set by the legislature.
Yeah. And I know there's some other significant needs that our lakes have around water quality.
And some of that registration money does go to those other places as well. But, and the last thing I want to point out in the interest of everybody's time here, and I'm happy to answer more questions, is just, we had a little bit of a discussion earlier about the importance of maximizing the federal investments to really make sure that you're getting the most investment out of the dollars being made available. But something I really want to make sure you all keep in mind as policymakers is that when you talk about the transportation world, there is very much a real cost to delay and to inaction. This is not like a policy debate where if you punt a decision to a summer study committee to come up with the solution next year, that there won't necessarily be consequences with that year of delay. Your infrastructure is always deteriorating. It always needs to be maintained. It will always be cheaper to maintain something than it will be to replace it later when it is further deteriorated. So I would just want to keep in the back of you all's minds as you think about this, that it is better in the big picture to try to make sure you're keeping up with your infrastructure needs on track, on pace, and proactively, because when you get behind the curve on this, it costs more in the big picture, and it gets very, very hard to get yourself back on track. So with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions you may have.
Thank you.
Yes. Representative Andrews.
I have two completely unrelated questions. One is like the big picture, which is with so much money going into transportation in a sort of unprecedented way, is the administration ready to do these projects? Are there enough people to do these projects is my real question. And then my second question is, did you have some philosophical ways that you decided how to suggest these increases?
So I'll start with the second one first.
And the first one, we can ask the agency to.
Okay, I can do that, sir.
The second one first is no. Again, this is not a proposal from JFO or from me. This is an illustration just to give you all some context. And I applied, what I quite frankly did was I took the data that DMV was very kindly to produce at our request, which was a hugely laborious task for them. Fortunately, the investments you all are making in their core modernization project is going to make this less laborious in the future. But I applied a standard inflationary growth rate that I thought was reasonable and on the low end, quite frankly, to everything that hadn't been adjusted since 2016, and rounded up to the nearest dollar and saw what it spat out. It's obviously up to the legislature whether you would want to make different changes to different lines, if you wanted to take a completely different approach. But I wanted to just start with something that was very not driven by anything other than if we plug in a number, let's see what happens.
So I remember the last time that we monkeyed around with trailer registration. And I noticed driving around, there's a lot of Vermont trucks hauling trailers that are registered in Maine. I guess that's just a word of caution. Yeah, I don't know if that can be addressed, or you may see more of it if we raise these again.
You're saying that people are registering their cars here and then registering their trailers in Maine?
No, like a contractor trailer.
Oh, okay.
Understood.
Sorry.
That makes more sense.
That is a very fair point to raise. I would defer to DMV on whether they've seen a market decline over time in the number of units registered here. I just don't know over time beyond what the two things were here that were listed. But I think it's a valid point that you certainly these fees apply to different sectors of the economy in different ways. And I think it is a completely fair thing for the legislature to incorporate that nuance into their decision-making process. Applying something across the board is one way to look at this. But, as you've seen from the chart, some fees, like in the agricultural sector, haven't been adjusted for a long time. I presume there were policy reasons for that. And I think the legislature can exert some policy here as well.
Well, thank you, Chris. You set us up really well for the questions we'll have.
My pleasure.
Maybe damaged our eyes a little bit. So we now are going to pick up H53, which is a bill not from the Transportation Committee, but a bill from the Judiciary Committee. And Representative Dolan, if you wanted to join us, tell us a little bit about it and give us a moment for us all to pull up the bill on our devices.
Yes. Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Representative Dolan here. Thank you for taking a look at H53. So we passed it out of House Judiciary last week and are happy you're taking a look at it. And really the goal of H53 is to align driver license suspensions to driving behavior and not have it related to if somebody does not pay a fine or fee on time. And doing that, one, to, let me step back for a little bit, is so that we're not penalizing people for not being able to pay on time for it. But then there's also this piece of it, there's a criminal piece of it, that if you get three, I forget, and I know that council's gonna be able to share this in more detail. If you get 3 civil DLSs in
The DLS.
sorry, driving with license suspended in a 2-year period, that it actually becomes a crime. And so if you're getting those because you are failing to pay, that's adding a criminal layer to it. So we passed it. We believe policy-wise, this makes sense. We do not want to have people lose their license just because they're not going to pay, because they can't get to work, they can't support their families, do all the things. The piece that comes to you is that there's a hit to the budget in different areas on this. And I feel like this is a bigger picture about the revenues for the criminal legal system of being associated with the fines and fees. And so we're looking to you to see, can we move this policy forward? Can things still be covered? Because we really don't think it makes sense to gather the revenue from this from people who can't pay, and that they should get their license suspended.
Thank you.
Yes.
Appreciate you coming in.
Yes.
Any questions? Okay, thanks so much. And Thea, I believe you are next up. Thank you. Nice to see you. I don't think you've been in here.
I have not been in here yet this year.
Very nice to have you.
For the record, Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel. I normally do transportation matters, not judiciary matters, but since this has to do with driver's licenses, I got to work on this bill. So I don't know if the committee wants me to put the bill up on the screen or.
That'd be great if you could.
Okay, great. So
If you don't mind.
share my screen then. Just a second. Okay, so H53 and Representative Dolan mentioned some of this in her little introduction, but I'm going to just talk about the big picture and then the main reason why this bill was referred here. Chris is going to be able to give you so much more detail on the rest of the finance side of things, and then I can do a quick walkthrough. And I will say that for a bill that is 6 pages long, there's really only like one substantive change, and then there are a lot of technical corrections to add like subdivision headings and things that we in Leg Council like to do. So the big picture, what this bill is doing is it's eliminating the suspension of driver's licenses or privileges to operate exclusively for the non-payment of a traffic violation that has points associated with it, also known as a moving violation. So one of the things that had happened prior to this policy proposal was there have been a lot of efforts to chip away at the number of suspensions. And there was, in a previous bill, before I started with Leg Council, the elimination of the suspension for the non-payment of all traffic violations. So it could have been something that had absolutely nothing to do with your behavior on the road. And if you didn't pay it, it would lead to your license being suspended. At present, the only non-payment of that can yield a license suspension is something that has points associated with it. But it's still the possibility of having your license suspended for the accumulation of points, and that's 10 points in a 2-year period, and they roll off. Nothing in this bill would change that. There are also, under federal law, requirements to have license suspensions for the non-payment of child support. Nothing changes with that in this bill. There are certain violations like refusing to take a breathalyzer. If you're pulled over for a suspected DUI, that can yield a suspension. Nothing's changing about that. So all this bill is doing is eliminating the suspensions for the non-payment of moving violations. And if you're wondering what a violation is, there is a very handy chart over on the DMV's website that will give you all of the different violations and if they have points associated with them. So you'll see in the column that has a lot of zeros, if there's a point there like a 2 or there are some that go all the way up to 10, that's going to be a moving violation. Those are the non-payment ofs that this bill is addressing. The reason why this bill, among other things that Chris will get into, is being referred to your committee is because under current law, if your license is suspended for any of the reasons that a license is allowed to be suspended, even if you've done everything that you need to do, you've had the length of the suspension, or you paid the amount that was owed, which would lift the suspension, because the suspensions for these non-payments is 30 days or until the civil penalty is paid, you still have to pay an $80 reinstatement fee, and that's in 23 VSA section 675. So you won't see anywhere in this bill a fee, but by not having license suspensions in this instance for the non-payment of moving violations, you're eliminating the reinstatement fee that the state would eventually collect before that person would be able to get their license back. That's the main reason the bill is being referred. Chris will also get into some of the user behavior and whether or not this is going to cause people to pay their tickets faster or slower or not at all. Nothing in this bill changes the other means that the state has to collect the civil penalties that are owed. There still would be civil contempt proceedings. There still could be the ability for the Judicial Bureau to have this go to a collection agency. So it's not changing the collectability of the moving violation civil penalties, just the stick of if you don't pay this, your license will be suspended. That's the big picture. How does that change in the statute? So the first thing that you're going to have at the bottom of page 1 is a subsection heading. This is just to help the reader of the statutes know what's being discussed in the subsection. Currently says late fees, suspensions for non-payment of certain traffic violation judgments, since there will no longer be suspensions for the non-payment of certain traffic violation judgments. The subsection heading is being amended to reflect that, and it's referencing payment plans, which is something that is currently allowed under law. It's just probably should have always been in the subsection heading and wasn't addressed. You then get to the whole point of the bill, which is striking out subdivision 2A. I know it's really hard to see what's being struck out, so I'm going to put up what it actually says. This is the current law 2A. In the case of a judgment on a traffic violation for which there can be points assessed, the judgment shall contain a notice that failure to pay or otherwise satisfy the amount due within 30 days will result in a suspension. You'll no longer need to give notice of the possibility of a suspension if there isn't the possibility of a suspension. And the payment plan options are available to avoid that. Don't need to provide notice of that, and we'll address payment plans later on. If the defendant fails to pay the amount due within 30 days of the notice, so we're now getting to the consequences of the non-payment, or by a later date determined by the Judicial Bureau, in the case of not pending on appeal, then the Judicial Bureau sends notice to the DMV, and then after 20 days from that notice, the DMV shall required suspend the person's operator's license or privilege to operate for a period of 30 days or until the amount due is satisfied, whichever is earlier. By striking all of that out, you are getting rid of that directive to the Judicial Bureau.
I know a lot of people in my community that I've either worked with or been friends with who sort of got one ticket and couldn't afford that one ticket. And then the price went up, the price went up, the price went up. And then they lost their license, couldn't afford to reinstate. And then they drove without a license because it's Vermont. And how do you make more money if you don't have a license? And so this bill is trying to fix that. Okay, great.
That's more of a her question.
I thought, look over there.
And I
Okay.
think the important thing to add too is if you get, and maybe that you're gonna get this, the criminal piece of it, if you get 3 of those in a 2-year period, then it turns into a criminal driving a license suspension. So I feel like that's important to this as well.
Okay, thanks.
So I actually wasn't going to get to that because it's not in the bill, but that's another piece of sort of the efforts that have been made over the years to address the license suspension piece. And I think it's sort of out of the what this committee needs to know to work on this bill, but there's a 2-page handout that's posted to both the House Judiciary's page and House Transportation that has the history of the legislative efforts going back to 2011 with respect to license suspensions. It talks about all the driver restoration days that have been had, the elimination of the suspensions for non-payment of traffic violations, not the reinstatement piece. But one of the things that is addressed there is in 2012, one of the amendments was to make amendments to the driver's license suspension criminal statute, which is 23 VSA section 674, to decrease the number of violations of the civil driving with suspended license, and that's in 676, that an individual can have before a criminal offense. And before the amendment, it was the 6th or subsequent in a 5-year period. So you needed to drive with your license suspended civilly 6 or more times in a 5-year period after July of 2003 to have it go to that criminal suspension. Now it's the 3rd or subsequent if the 2 prior are within 2 years and it's only on or after December of 2016. So current law, it's a 2-year look back, and it's the 3rd civil suspension in that 2-year look back that's going to transition it from a civil suspension to a criminal suspension. And to talk about sort of the potential trickle down effect, if you get one driving with your license, if you get that moving violation, you don't pay it, your license is suspended, you need to get to work, you drive, you're potentially going to get pulled over and get a driving with license suspended civil. And then you do that again, you've got your 2, one more, and it's going to be criminal. So it does have.
I mean, again, just emphasize what you're saying. I mean, I've heard and seen these differences in my community, again, where in a rural community, there are no public transportation options, and you can't ride a bike 30 miles in the snow in the winter. And so, criminalizing poverty is something that we have an opportunity to address that I'm excited about.
Representative Denrow, Representative Anthony.
Representative Taylor might remember some of our discussions about Justice Reinvestment 2 back in Corrections and Institutions in 2020. And back then we were talking about technical furlough violations that would send people back to prison for really, they might have lost housing, they might have lost transportation, they may have lost a job for any number of different snowballing reasons that weren't really their fault. And I think this really reminds me of those conversations. It's setting people up to fail, and I think this was a great bill.
Thank you. I don't think I could, with a straight face, or sleep well because these current war, which is really pretty embarrassing, frankly. But I follow the money, and I happen to have been in the Judiciary Committee at the time when the discussion was, yes, but what about the deterrent for people paying up, et cetera? And the answer is most of the fine money is collected through the garnishee of income tax owed. There's virtually no successful collections, other than the Department of Tax essentially holding back refunds. So it's not like you're giving away money by supporting this bill and saying, this is just uncivilized.
And am I correct that someone in this situation would still receive points, right, against their license? So
I know it still count towards the
teeth entirely. People can't pay.
Representative Canfield, and then we'll hear from Chris.
Where does the money go when the fine is paid?
That's going to be
Chris.
A Chris question. I can tell you that the $80 reinstatement fee goes to the T fund, and everything else talk to Chris about.
What was the last thing you said?
Chris will say it.
Chris will tell you more than you need to know. I just have a few things to finish in the bill, and then you can move to the money. So you've got some more technical corrections, changing a person to an individual. A person can be a corporation. Corporations don't have driver's licenses. And this is changing at the minimum, the Judicial Bureau shall offer a payment plan option. I think currently they are offering payment plan options to everyone, but it's striking out the piece that says the payment plan options are to avoid suspension of the license, because you're not going to have license suspensions anymore, but payment plan should still happen. I think it's interesting to know what the payment plans are. It's not more than, but it could be less than $30 per traffic violation per month, and not to exceed $100 per month if the individual has 4 or more outstanding judgments. The final potentially substantive, but maybe not substantive change is in terms of the Judicial Bureau commencing civil contempt proceedings. It doesn't currently say that if you're complying with a payment plan that they cannot commence civil contempt proceedings. A lot of C's there. I think in practice, there is no way that the finding for civil contempt could be met, because under statute, it needs to have a finding that the defendant failed to pay all or any portion of the amount due. And if you're complying with the payment plan, then you've paid at least a portion of the amount that's due. But this is making it clear in statute that the Judicial Bureau cannot start those civil contempt proceedings if the defendant is complying with the payment plan. Everything else that you see in the bill until Section 2, the effective date, are all technical corrections, adding in subdivision headings, adding in hyphens to first-class mail. But I do want to talk about the effective dates, because this isn't something where you can just sort of draw a line in the sand and say this is effective on boom date. You need to have a little bit of explanation there. So it would take effect on passage. It wouldn't change anything about any of the suspensions that are currently being served. Those would hit the end of their 30 days, but there will be no new suspensions for any non-payment at that point going forward. So if you have a moving violation on the day of passage, non-payment of that will not then yield. Another thing it doesn't do is it doesn't automatically reinstate all of those licenses. If your license is suspended and the effective date of the bill on passage, you would still need to pay that $80 reinstatement fee. It doesn't change anything about that. But going forward, there wouldn't be those new suspensions. There wouldn't be the reinstatement fees collected for that. I think that is my segue to let you ask Chris questions about the money, unless anyone else has questions about the bill.
Representative.
Was there any discussion about retroactivity?
There was not a discussion when I was there, but I was certainly not there for every conversation that House Judiciary had.
And I think we did talk about it, and the fact that the suspension would end within 30 days. For like I say, so they're going to be able to start driving and be able to earn money. We did talk about it and balanced it with just having it start that.
Thank you.
Round of any questions?
Appreciate it. Chris, welcome back.
He didn't ask if the belts and suspender.
I only have to do it once a week.
Okay.
Not every day. That would get very tiresome.
All right.
Thanks for
Just looking, just.
No, thanks for looking out for me.
For the record, Chris Roop, Joint Fiscal. So as Anthea already did a very, very good walkthrough of the bill, but we did a fiscal note that probably has more information than you'll ever need on this. But I just want to sort of start at the bottom line is if you don't, so nothing in this bill would reduce the amount an individual would otherwise owe in terms of like their traffic tickets or the court penalties or so on and so forth. The most significant impact from the bill would be if you have fewer licenses being suspended, you're going to have fewer reinstatement fees being paid into the transportation fund. It's really that's sort of the top line. Reinstatement fees, we expect, so the data is extremely imperfect with these because and I have like an entire page that just goes through the caveats of how complicated this stuff is. And I'm not going to do that now, but roughly 43% or so of the suspensions were due solely to failure to pay amounts due. There's plenty of other situations where that could be one component and there could be other behavioral things involved, but just due solely to failure to pay amounts due, you're looking at roughly 43% of them. There is imperfection in being able to correlate the number of suspensions to the number of reinstatements, because you could be subject to multiple suspensions, but only pay one reinstatement fee. You could have that reinstatement fee reduced or waived by a hearing officer. There's timing considerations where, you might have a license suspended and not reinstated promptly. So there's a lot of noise in the data. But bottom line, we think that just, based on how much money we bring in from these reinstatement fees, you apply roughly 43% to that number that brings in, you're looking at roughly a $200,000 on average amount of foregone revenue to the transportation fund. Now.
Wait.
Yes, sir.
Is 43% something specific to this bill, or is it one that you frequently use?
That's what the data pointed us to.
I'm just curious.
So, this feels awkward based on what I was just talking about here, but I want to highlight that it's, on its face, it might feel awkward, but we're really not talking about incongruent concepts here. I think, I think you need to be mindful of the fact that the legislature has the ability to exert some sort of policy in how it determines fees. And I think it's completely fair to you to consider not just the dollars, but where are the best and most appropriate places to raise those dollars from. So I just want to say that these are not necessarily completely contradictory conversations. I think they're both very fair conversations for you all to consider. But a question was raised about where the money goes. I am not going to be your judicial fines and fees expert. That's my colleague, Dan Dickerson. But here's a little chart that just shows you at a high level where, if you get pulled over on 100B on your way in here, not that that's ever happened to me, the amount you pay would go to the civil penalty would go to the transportation fund. Municipalities do get some portion of the violation based on like municipal enforcement within the limits of the town. But when we're talking about on a state highway somewhere, the amount of the actual traffic violation goes to the T fund, brings in around $3 million a year. It's been declining because the amount of tickets being written is way down. There's Judicial Bureau surcharges and penalties that go to the various funds. But what we're really talking about here is the last one, that $80 DMV license reinstatement fee would be the one that would be impacted. The other things I raised in the fiscal note was, so that's the top line. The other two things I flagged was, if there's fewer suspensions and reinstatements to process as a result of this, it's not going to have a huge impact on the administrative operations of either the Judicial Bureau or the DMV. The back end processes are automated in terms of how the Judicial Bureau's computer talks to the DMVs. The generation of the letters is relatively automated at DMV. You'd save some postage costs from not having to mail as many suspension letters out. Judicial Bureau would probably have some one-time costs associated with if they need to reprint tickets to not have it speak to this pay up within 30 days or else be suspended. Some one-time computer configuration costs. Both are expected to be pretty de minimis. And one thing I raised as a potential risk, but not something I'm opining on, is that the timing of the collections to the special funds could be impacted if this legislation induces behavior to change. I am not making any speculation that behavior would change, but just to reiterate that, you wouldn't necessarily, this legislation would not reduce what you would owe to those special funds. But if more people would, for example, choose a payment plan than they otherwise would, or if a delinquency rate increases that forces more collections activity to happen through the tax offset process, that could alter the timing of when payments are made. So we don't know what that impact's going to be right now, but I raise it as just a potential risk to those funds. And with that, that's the fiscal note.
And I agree with you. I don't think this is an incongruous conversation. I think when we talk about fees and revenues and funds and all that, we're always balancing like good policy and regressive nature and all of those things with each other as we're moving forward with it. Further questions, conversations?
Just a comment. Thank you for all this.
Sure.
This committee, as you may remember, or other members may remember, has talked about the fees going to various funds in the previous, from time to time. And we acknowledged, I think we should all recognize that a number of those funds are in trouble from time to time. And this won't affect the net available funds in those funds, I think, enough to make much of a difference at all. I mean, I don't see, they may need to be restructured at some point in time and find another source of revenue because there's not enough, so. But I think I think the bill's fine as presented.
Thanks, Chris. Sure thing.
Any other? I would wonder if there's any further discussion or thoughts from anyone. Yeah, Chris.
Was there, just talking with other folks on judiciary, was there a letter that was being sent along with judiciary about?
Oh, there was, and we
something?
meant to post it. I forgot about that. Thank you, there was. Thank you. I think Martin sent it to me like last week and I forwarded it to you last week.
Oh, you might have.
We're gonna forward it to everyone right now. Re-forwarding to Tricia.
memo?
Yep,
Yes, I have it. All right, I'm
Okay.
gonna forward it and post it.
thank you, Chris.
Oh, Chris.
Is it coming by email or?
Yes, but I will read it aloud. How does that sound?
That's
That
perfect.
sounds good.
Oh, good, okay, everyone like really, get ready for story time. From Martin Lalonde, Chair of House Judiciary, regarding funding consideration for H53 relating to driver's license suspensions. That was on the 21st. On February 17th, 2023, the House Judiciary Committee passed H53, an act related to driver's license suspensions with a vote of 10-1-0. H53 would eliminate the suspension of driver's licenses for failure to pay fines associated with moving violations, those associated with points on a driver's record. The Judiciary Committee has passed this bill so that licenses are suspended only for unsafe driving, the accumulation of 10 points or DUIs, not for the inability to pay a fine associated with moving violations. Fines would still be imposed and collected, including through the tax offset process. But one would not have their license suspended solely for failure to timely pay. When someone loses their driver's license, they must pay an $80 reinstatement fee to get their license back. In considering H53, House Judiciary reviewed a draft fiscal note indicating that a potential impact of $200,000 in foregone revenue to the transportation fund from the reduction in reinstatement fees due to a reduction in license suspensions. That is quite a sentence, Martin Lalonde. In addition, the bill may negatively impact the collection of fines and judicial bureau fees, though that impact was not quantifiable. The reduction in fines and judicial bureau fees could impact court-related special funds. House Judiciary appreciates the thoughtful and comprehensive work of the House Ways and Means Committee in addressing potential impact and wants to highlight our specific areas of concern. Understanding that the Crime Victims Restitution Fund, the Victims Compensation Special Fund, and the Domestic Violence and Sexual Violence Special Fund may be impacted from a decrease in collected fines and judicial bureau fees, House Judiciary asks these funds remain fully funded as we continue to navigate policy work that addresses economic disparities in our criminal justice system, such as seen in H53. It's also in your email, so you don't have to actually remember what I just said. And so what I hear from that is they would very much like us to pass this, and they recognize that sort of their ongoing work towards justice might negatively be impacting some of the funds that are important for justice, and so they want us to keep a focus on those funds in other ways. Is that?
Yes, correct. It also went to appropriations as well.
Okay, thank you.
Are we poised to hear more, or are we prepared to?
I just want to see if anyone else wants to add anything to the discussion.
Yeah, it just kind of sounds like an appropriations thing versus a fee to me, about keeping it whole. I'm just thinking back to the testimony we heard from Judiciary, what was it? Supreme Court there.
About IT funds.
Yeah, and when they're gonna increase or want to increase the failure to pay fee, but we're gonna get rid of a suspension for failure to pay. They kind of go against one another.
The judiciary fee conversation has not come back up because I got sort of broad feedback from the committee, including from my own brain, that those fee increases felt quite uncomfortable.
Okay.
So thank you for bringing that up. Yes.
But I think, at least for myself, we want to help make sure that our agencies have the technology they need. And so let's
Absolutely,
make sure
yes.
that we don't, I would love to continue to have that conversation. Let's get government what it needs to perform its functions, but let's not do it on the backs of poor people.
That's right. And many judicial fees are, and so fees might not be the solution to the judicial fund problem.
May I add to that?
You may.
Sherry will also be providing a memo regarding those fees as well.
Oh, wow, all right.
Okay. We like these memos, judiciary. This is a fun thing. Anyone else?
Very officious.
Okay. Yeah, and I agree, more of an appropriations issue at this point.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion that we vote on this bill.
I'll second it.
3,
Okay,
if you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay.
Representative Demrow moved, Representative Sims seconded. Any further conversation? Discussion? Okay, if you could call the roll.
Andrews, yes. Anthony,
Yes.
Beck,
Yes.
Brannigan,
Yes.
Demrow,
Yes.
Maslin.
Yep.
Matos,
Yeah.
Bodie,
Yes.
Sims,
Yes.
Taylor,
Yes.
Canfield,
Yes.
Kornheiser.
Yes.
12-0-0.
Thank you.
Would you like to report on this bill?
We'll figure that out.
Okay.
And with that, thank you, everyone. We are gonna go eat lunch and then we're back here at 1 to hear from the Department of Motor Vehicles